The park's chief of interpretation, Beth Stern, if I don't know if she's still here, she just collared me a minute ago and wanted me to reiterate to you all. I mentioned that the 5:30 tour, the Confederate attack tour, is not going to follow the exact Confederate assault because of the heat. It's been truncated or curtailed a little bit. It's just going to be up here. But she wanted me to remind you that that means that there will be no meeting down at the parsonage at 5:30 like your program says. So just disregard all of that and remember 5:30 for the real-time tour of the assaults at Malvern Hill, and we will gather probably where we just did a few minutes ago, in front of the parking lot or around the tents or something like that. Somebody will start yelling at you at 5:30 and tell you where you need to be for that tour, for those of you who are still around to go on it. All right, our chief job here is to orient you to the ground and talk a little bit about why the Union troops had such a powerful position, and tell you a little bit about the landmarks on the battlefield as well. This is the best view, in my opinion, the best view that you get on the Malvern Hill battlefield, because you can see the same things that we see over on that side of the road, but suddenly the whole eastern side of the road is available to you, and then the southeastern corner of Malvern Hill is available to you as well. When General McClellan's army marched here on the night of June the 30th and the morning of July the 1st, they'd had troops here since the day before, since June the 30th, so they were a little bit familiar with the landscape and its potential. And McClellan waved some of his troops on toward the James River, and he massed the majority of his army behind you and to the right rear. Because Malvern Hill, as powerful and as dominating a position as it was and is, there's still very little room to set up an army and confront the pursuing Confederates coming from the north. The majority of you all are facing north. Remember the Frazier's Farm or Glendale battlefield of June the 30th is no more than 1.5 miles or 2 miles to your north. So it's not like there was a long march involved with this pursuit. On the morning of July the 1st, the Confederates pulled up short of the hill pretty early on and began looking at what awaited them. And General McClellan was on the field the morning of July the 1st. The Army commander, he is often lambasted for not being around as much as he should have been, but he was here. He rode up and down the lines of the Union troops who cheered him and applauded him and shouted at him, and he loved that. He enjoyed the attention, the positive attention especially, and who wouldn't? And he helped deploy the Union line of battle, but then he left it to his deputies to make the final dispositions. And what they came up with was a horseshoe-shaped line that faced mostly north. And the key thing at Malvern Hill, the thing that nobody ever understands until they come to this battlefield, even if they've read about it all their lives, the key thing is how narrow the crest of Malvern Hill really is, from its western slope to its eastern slope. The crest of Malvern Hill is where our parking lot is and where we're standing. And it's approximately 900 yards across from Malvern Cliffs, which is the ground that's over in those trees today, to your left, just beyond the parking lot, drops off very sharply there. Some of you hopefully have walked the trail today and seen some of that. From Malvern Cliffs across your front, through the yard of this house, the West House, and then on over to the edge of Western Run is about 900 yards. And so there was only room for McClellan and his subordinates to place 2 divisions of infantry, maybe 10,000 men at most, across the nose of this horseshoe, as I'm calling it. And they sprinkled it liberally with cannon, perhaps 30, maybe as many as 40 cannon across the front of Malvern Hill. But when people come out here, they don't understand any of this, and they think Malvern Hill needs to look like Marie's Heights, or Lookout Mountain, or Little Round Top, or some very discernible elevation, and it's really not. This part of Malvern Hill is very gentle. In fact, the Confederate cannon, about 1,000 yards to our northwest, I hope some of you were here when they fired at us about an hour and a half ago and you saw that demonstration. That elevation is the same elevation as this one. So the Federal artillery here did not even have the advantage of higher ground. What they had was these sweeping, unobstructed fields of fire, which meant that any Confederate bold enough to attack the nose of the horseshoe here had no cover after stepping out of the distant tree line. Now the rest of the horseshoe, of course, to be a horseshoe, needs to bend back. And so from the parking lot, extending southward that way toward the back end of Malvern Hill, paralleling Malvern Cliffs, the high part of Malvern Hill, The Union line extended back that way. The United States Regulars Division was over there and some others, and a lot of artillery. They were facing westward out toward what we know today as Route 5, the River Road, and ultimately toward the James River. Not much action, especially on the lower end of that horseshoe. But then the other part of the horseshoe goes back this way, facing east and extending southward through these fields. And this is all National Park Service property. Everything around us and back in that direction was preserved by the Civil War Trust maybe 6 years ago, off the top of my head, 5, 6, 7 years ago, something like that. 242-acre purchase out here, which included the house and all of this ground. And so when you read the accounts, the Union soldiers so full of confidence that this position was unbreakable, all you have to do is stand here and imagine 3 corps of infantry in reserve across these fields. Now, obviously you couldn't see all of them from right here, but there'd be a corps of infantry stacked up back here, the 3rd Corps mostly in reserve, and a couple of other corps beyond them, and that really is the ultimate point. This position was so strong that McClellan and his subordinates didn't even have room to deploy all of their army. They were stacked up in reserve, waiting for a chance to do something, to join the fray, to shoot Confederates who were imprudent enough to attack across these fields toward the crest of Malvern Hill. And some of you, if you got over to the white tent way over in the tree line, there was a fellow who had the sword of Captain Beam on display. Did some of you get over there and see that? Yeah, good, I'm glad. We didn't do as good a job advertising it as we should have. I'm glad some of you got over there. Captain Beam is a good illustration for what happened here, because the Union 3rd Corps batteries were stretched across those fields, facing northeast, that way, toward the Confederate artillery concentration at the Poindexter Farm. And when we're done with this tour, if you all go over to the Poindexter Farm, you'll be at the origin of the Confederate bombardment that came in this way, and Captain Beam was killed somewhere out in these fields, probably 700-800 yards to my left front. So this is a legitimate part of the battlefield. Even though the 3rd Corps was not attacked by Confederate infantry, they dueled with Confederate artillery, and furthermore, they prevented, their mere presence prevented the Confederates from getting notions about going around Malvern Hill. Who would want to attack straight up Malvern Hill if you could go around it? And when the battle began, late in the afternoon, General Lee actually had given up on going straight up Malvern Hill, and he was over there looking for a way to get around Malvern Hill. But this horseshoe configuration meant that there was no dangling flank to get around. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find a place that was below the Union line. So that orients you a little bit to the story of the crest of Malvern Hill and its many advantages defensively. This house, the West House, has been rebuilt. The original was burned or was torn down in the early 1900s and was replaced on more or less the same foundation. It's not the same configuration. The original wartime West House pushed out to your north just a little bit more, but some of this foundation is original. We've done archaeology out here to find the footprint of the original building. We know that there were some people in the house on the day of the battle. If I'd known I was going to lead this walking tour, I would have brought the account that described it, but I will paraphrase it for you. A Minnesota chaplain who was roaming the ground here on the morning of July the 1st came over to the West House and found a terrified family inside and counseled them on what to do, and their decision was to actually go into the basement of the house and to raise a red flag from the roof as a symbol that it was, it's not a target, not an enemy location. They tried to prevent the Confederate artillery from bombarding the West House. Whether those were Wests or someone else, I don't know. The personal details of the Wests and the Crews, who were over in the crew house or owned the crew house, and the Binfords. The Binford house is gone, but it was back on the ridge to your right rear. Very confusing. They don't show up in the census regularly. We're not always sure precisely who was in which building 150 years ago today, but they're all important landmarks on the cultural landscape. And when we talk about the power of the Union artillery at the crest of Malvern Hill, remember it's the fields of fire. Most of you are positioned so that you can see the twin chimneys over there. That is about 800 yards in front of us to the north. Those are the ruins of the parsonage, the Methodist Church parsonage from Willis Church. The Littleton family lived there on the morning of the battle. Mr. Littleton was the preacher at Willis Church, and a kind-hearted New Hampshire soldier who was not even engaged in the Battle of Malvern Hill. He just fell out of line when he marched past and knocked on the door and talked to the Littletons and tried to explain to them the magnitude of what was about to happen to their lives, and escorted them to safety through the Union lines and back to the rear. And the parsonage became one of the great landmarks on the battlefield because that is the center of the Confederate attack line. Just beyond those twin chimneys, the ground drops off to the valley of Western Run, and when the Confederates got the word, the unwelcome word, that they needed to make this attack, they formed up, at least opposite us, they formed up in the valley of the creek and pushed on up through the yard of the parsonage. And now as you stand here and you understand the dimensions of the Union line, you can understand the ordeal a little bit better. We always think about it from the other side of the road, but it's equally bad here. All of that distance between here and the parsonage exposed to Federal fire. Except if you walk the trail on your own someday, maybe when it's not 108 degrees, the Park Service trail between here and there, you will discover that the ground on this side of the road, the east side of the road, has many nooks and crannies and swales and hollows. Maybe some of you have been out there today and saw it for yourselves. And so the ground there is not quite as shell swept as the ground over on the other side, the parking lot side of Route 156. Confederates attacking on that side of the road had very little shelter, just that famous swale that we've been talking about all afternoon. Confederates coming this direction had a little bit more cover when they stepped out from the parsonage, and to deal with that, the Union commanders decided to push their infantry forward before the Confederate attacks began. So this side of the road and that side of the road distinctly different from each other in the way the battle evolved. Over there, artillery controlled everything, and the infantry was in reserve, back where our cars are parked, because the artillery could control everything, and if there was some slight danger, the infantry would rush forward in front of the cannon and deal with whatever Confederates had been unwise enough to get within rifle range. But over here, the artillery was right in front of the West House, and then, as I told you, stretching back through those fields, but the infantry was in front of the cannon, so that the Confederates could not take advantage of any dead ground over there, what they call defilade, low ground where they would be invisible. And so it's a difference of night and day. I've started telling people that this road, the historic road that separates the two fields, it's like there was a see-through plexiglass barrier along the road. Obviously there wasn't, but they conducted operations on this side of the road, completely ignoring what happened on the other side of the road. So think about this. Union infantry pushing forward to their assigned position. This would be Couch's division. Darius Couch of the Union 4th Corps, his only action during the 7 days battles, pushed forward in front of the guns, a couple hundred yards at least, maybe even a little more, close up to the parsonage. If Couch's men in the middle of the battle had turned and looked straight left across the road, they would have been looking at Confederates who were attacking past the end of their line, trying to get up the slope toward the Union cannon. And yet, as far as I know, there was no major action between the contending armies crisscrossing the road. Nobody on this side of the road turned and shot that way, at least not in major numbers, or vice versa. So you need to think of this almost as two separate, physically connected battlefields, but for practical purposes, not really connected at all. The road was the barrier that separated the way they fought on this side from the way they fought on that side. And General Couch had three very experienced brigade commanders under his control. Together, the four of them, Couch and his three brigade commanders, Abercrombie, Howe, and what's the third one? Palmer, thank you. Abercrombie, Howe, and Palmer. Those four generals combined had something like 85 years of military experience among them before the Civil War. They were fresh troops. They didn't fight at Mechanicsville. They didn't fight at Gaines's Mill. They didn't fight at Savage's Station. They didn't fight at Glendale/Fraser's Farm. They had done nothing previous to this. And so they were eager for the fight, and Couch's division pushed forward and anchored the front right of the Union horseshoe and repulsed all Confederate attacks in that direction until very late in the day when they began to run low on ammunition. And at that point, Union reserves came up abundant, thousands, tens of thousands, 20 of thousands of them in reserve behind you, waiting for their orders, waiting for their chance. And they came up through this ground behind you, across the Binford Farm and the West Farm, pushed in front of the West House, picked their way through the roaring line of Union cannon, and Couch's division was mostly relieved later in the day by Sickles's New York Brigade, what is called the Excelsior Brigade, 5 regiments, mostly from New York City, 70th, 71st, 72nd, 73rd, and 74th New York, even I can remember that, 70 through 74. And then later, Francis Barlow led some reserves up through here as well, the 81st Pennsylvania and the 81st New York, I believe. So they started their journey well to your rear and marched right through this field behind you and elbowed their way to the front and set up a firing line which controlled this hard shoulder of the Union horseshoe. And no Confederate got within probably 300 yards of the West House, in my view, on this side of the road. And so it's a very different battle over here. It's equally dramatic, but not quite as devastating to be on this side of the road as it would have been to be on that side of the road where the artillery held sway over everything in sight in both directions. What sort of questions are there here, if any? Yes?
With Israel Richardson's division, Mars Brigade's over there. How did he get so separated? How did Mars Brigade get so separated from the rest of the division?
How did Mars Irish Brigade get so separated from the rest of the division? Because the Irish Brigade attacked right through the parking lot at twilight and through the cannon and over toward the slave cabins, which many of you know the location of over there where the small cedar trees are off at about 10 o'clock from where most of you are standing over on the far tree line. How did they get separated? And the answer is that FitzJohn Porter, who was the commander of the Union 5th Corps and who was the site supervisor, to use a modern term. FitzJohn Porter was the senior man here. After McClellan rode along and waved his hat and got applauded, he went to the rear. FitzJohn Porter, his deputy, was the man who controlled things here, who helped coordinate with Couch, who helped coordinate with Morell's division, which was the other Union division on that side of the road. And Porter rode back here, having summoned help, met the Irish Brigade, and waved them forward in that direction. All of these reserves were brought up not for a specific, or not for a general purpose, but for a specific purpose, to either plug holes that were developing or to replace troops that were running out of ammunition. So they simply reacted to each need, as if the Irish Brigade hadn't been the next up, they would have taken one from the 3rd Corps or whomever else showed up. It just turned out that the Irish Brigade was next in line when it came time to go off in that direction toward the slave cabins. Is there a question over here? Yes?
How far in that direction did the Union line extend generally?
Question is, how far in that direction did the Union line extend generally? Well, I believe it went over to about the tall tree line that you see there in the distance, whatever that is, 300-400 yards across the way, and then started bending back, and it went for a couple of miles, or a mile and a half to the south. That horseshoe goes way back there. If you go home and look at your battle maps, you'll see 3 Union Corps in reserve back here on the right leg of the horseshoe. So for all intents and purposes, though, the front of the Union line did not go all the way to those trees. It went, the house is blocking our view because the stream winds back in that direction. So the nose of the horseshoe goes off to the right front of the West House and then starts bending back. So as I said, I measured it once on Google Earth or something and came up with 900 or 950 yards from Malvern Cliffs to the first drop off into Western Run over here. So that's just a tiny bit more than half a mile across the crest of Malvern Hill. The only room for 2 divisions. Yes?
Some of the pictures, the paintings show the grass about as tall as this. Was that the same way on the other side? I know that it looks like just brambles and stuff over there.
Well, we don't have any historic photographs of the battlefield from 1862. We don't have, I've never seen any good sketches even by participants. I've seen some stick figure sketches, the kind of thing I might draw if I was trying to do it, but I haven't seen anything professional that goes into that level of detail. Alfred Waugh drew some sketches which are good, but they're not terrain oriented necessarily. We have no wartime sketch of the West House. We have no wartime sketch of the Crew House. The ones we have are from post-war. We have no photographs, but essentially the vast majority of the Malvern Hill battlefield was freshly harvested wheat, precisely what you have behind you right here in this field. closely cropped, piled up in sheafs and bundles, and laying around the battlefield. Now, don't misunderstand me that it was not 1,000 acres of harvested wheat. There were some oats and there was some clover and maybe some fallow fields mixed in there, but the vast majority of what the battle occurred upon was recently harvested wheat. They apparently were doing the harvesting at the end of June in this part of Henrico County. Don't know exactly who did the work here, probably the Crew family slaves or maybe somebody connected with the West Binford complex. The farm diary for Shirley Plantation, which is only 5 or 6 miles down the James River, famous old Shirley, it shows that while the 7 days battles were roaring up in Hanover County, they were ignoring them and were harvesting their wheat at Shirley on June 27, June 28, June 29. So I presume this was the time in 1862 to harvest the wheat.
Were the U.S. gunboats able to fire this far?
Were U.S. gunboats able to fire this far? I'm glad you asked. I should have mentioned that. U.S. gunboats were able to fire this far. The northward bend in the James River, what's called Turkey Island Bend, is only about 1.5 miles, I would say, on a direct line from here, even though the main part of the James River is farther back. So they anchored 3 gunboats up there in the bend of the river and lobbed shells with indirect fire among the Confederates who were massing at the foot of the hill. They absolutely had this range, but the whole process of controlling and adjusting remote fire was in its infancy. They had a wigwag system. They had signalmen up there on the very back crest of Malvern Hill, and had some system where they would spot the outgoing shell and then make adjustments, but it was not anything sophisticated and it didn't work very well. And as many of you know, one of those gunboat shells apparently landed short right over next to the crew house, a direct hit on a Rhode Island battery, and knocked out the gun and the crew, or at least most of the crew, in one direct hit. And that was fairly early on in the battle. And of course, when the word about that got around, Fitzjohn Porter gave that signal for the indirect fire. No more gunboat shells. The Confederates continued to maintain forever after that they took heavy gunboat shell fire, tremendous shells whirling through the air, and they probably took some, but much of what they took was also from larger Union cannon that were posted around Malvern Hill. Not 100-pounder rifled cannon, but large field pieces that were deployed around Malvern Hill. 2 more.
Bobby, what was the nature of the guns? Was 29 guns at one time? Were they Napoleons or Rodman's rifle guns? What were they?
The question is, what were the nature of the guns? What sort of ordnance across the crest of the hill? I think they had a little bit of everything here. They wouldn't have no Rodmans at the very front for most of the battle, but primarily Napoleons and Parrott rifles. I don't remember if there's any 12-pounder howitzers. Glenn, do you remember? I see you back there. 12-pounder howitzers in the Union line at all? Not in the Union line, no. So it's Napoleons, a few Parrotts, and maybe some 3-inch ordnance rifles mixed in. But of course, whenever a battery ran out of ammunition, there were dozens of them clamoring for their chance, and so they would just cycle right on out and be replaced. So the ordnance would have changed, shuffled through, with the exception of Ames's battery over there, where we fired our cannon this afternoon. They, as you know from the sign, fired 1,392 rounds from those 6 guns. Those are Napoleons. So apparently when it came time to be cycled out, they didn't want to be cycled out and just got more ammunition instead. But if you plot the evolution of the Union batteries, there's a lot of replacements coming in and out during the course of the day. And some of the batteries even, I believe, pushed forward of this line quite some distance closer to the parsonage late in the day. One last question so we don't finish late. Yes?
Is there any record about if the farmers had problems farming these fields in the days and weeks and months after the battle?
Is there any record about farmers having trouble farming these fields in the days, weeks, months, and years after this battle? I presume you mean with ordnance, yes. Digging up shells and so forth. I'm sure they did, but I'm sure they were accustomed to it. Every Civil War battle would have these kinds of problems. The larger problem at the end of the war was plowing without disturbing graves. And there is, I'm aware of a flurry of correspondence in the Richmond newspapers in about 1867 or 68, in which the Confederate veterans in Richmond, this is only 5 or 6 years after the battle, Confederate veterans received word that the farmers up here, the Malvern Hill people and the Crews and maybe whoever owned the West House by that time, had been plowing up Confederate bodies and were not being respectful of them. They'd gather up the bones and throw them over to the edge of the field or something. And so there was a committee of veterans established to come out and investigate this. And they brought out wagons and they were ready to rescue the remains of their comrades who were being disturbed out here. And it turned out to be mostly a false alarm. They found 6 or 7 Confederate graves, I think the account says, that they respectfully disinterred and moved into Hollywood. And so the farmers were not disturbing the graves in large numbers, but that doesn't solve the question of where all the Confederate dead were, because they were not moved in large numbers into Richmond. Those guys found 6 or 7. I think the majority of them are still out here in the woods. Some of them were removed by family members after the war or during the war, but there is no systematic removal of Confederate graves. I think that would be a bigger problem than too much metal and iron in your disturbing your plow. I think avoiding graves would be a bigger issue for the veterans. Okay, it is 3 after. It'll take us 5 minutes to walk back there so that we'll be right on time and give you plenty of opportunity to go up to the Poindexter Farm, which I encourage you to do. You can't go over there normally. It's not National Park Service property. It's not Civil War Trust property. So if you haven't been over there, you got to do it now. And that program starts at 4:30. Thank you for coming out. If you have questions, I'll be right here.